to clarify that, originally I was going to give a talk that I gave several times on the west coast of the United States last fall. And as I pulled the talk out the other day to think about coming here, I realized that half of it was on Belgian symbolism. And I thought, how cheeky could it be for me to have the temerity to come to the country itself and talk to you about your own stuff? So I decided I should change it up a bit, and I removed those extended passages on Ferdinand Knopf, and there's still some Belgians that appear here, but at any rate. So this is a slightly different account. But I had plenty to choose from, because this book, this is the cover of the book that will be published by Oxford University Press in November. The book is about 500 pages, and there's a website that goes with it that has about 500 images and assorted film clips and audio clips and all sorts of other materials that couldn't be squeezed into the book itself. So, let me begin. In 1923, when dust jackets, I don't know how legible, well, I guess it is legible up there. In 1923, when dust jackets still adhered to an advertising model that forwarded verbal pitch over visual image, and this is very characteristic of what book jackets looked like in 1923, the publisher provided a contextual note on the cover of The Pilgrimage of Festus by Conrad Aiken. Festus is an odyssey of the soul of modern man. It is the wasteland set to a magical music, but sharing none of its bitterness. Aiken, Eliot's Harvard classmate, had reviewed The Wasteland for the New Republic the previous year, insisting on the integrity of its emotional ensemble as more important than any intellectual design accessed by the red herring of its famous footnotes. Aiken audaciously suggested that Eliot's poem succeeded by virtue of its incoherence. We accept the poem as we would accept a powerful, melancholy tone poem, he explained. Aiken's reference reflects his own pursuit of magical music by literary means. In 1916, he had published a book-length poem with the title The Jig of Wasteland, subtitled A Symphony. When it was collected with 4 other so-designated symphonies in 1949 under the title The Divine Pilgrim, the book opened with a neo-pagan salute to the cosmos. It opens with these 2 lines. She rose in moonlight and stood confronting sea with her bare arms uplifted. So begins this belated and over-ripened product of the fin de siècle, nearly half a century later. The raised arms are a heraldic gesture reiterated by numerous artists of the time, shepherded into the 20th century on calendars by Maxfield Parrish and in the photographic movement of pictorialism. Ecstatic supplication was the signature remonstrance as the century neared its end, arms raised in total exposure, surrender, and petition. But the Divine Pilgrim is not dated by a single image alone. Aiken's presentation of the work as symphonic draws on a 19th century aspiration to absorb musical qualities into the other arts. By the turn of the century, galleries were filled with paintings called sonatas, or bearing other markers of musical association, a trend that had largely subsided by the time Aiken was prefacing his symphonies with references to absolute music, contrapuntal themes, harmony, and counterpoint. Asked by Harriet Monroe to review 3 of his own poems, his symphonic poems, for Poetry magazine, Aiken recounted his aspirations in terms that could have been plucked from a symbolist credo of the 1880s. He expressed himself as being in quest of a sort of absolute poetry in which the chief characteristic is its elusiveness, its fleetingness, and its richness in the shimmering overtones of hint and suggestion. Aiken was not alone among poets of his generation in pursuit of the musical analogy. The imagist from Arkansas is a very obscure American state that is mainly famous for being the birthplace of Bill Clinton, but it had no claim to fame like that when John Gould Fletcher, the future imagist, was born there. He prefaced a collection of his own poetic symphonies the same time as Aiken was doing this, with the observation The second half of the 19th and the first 15 years of the 20th century have been a period of research, of experiment, of unrest, and questioning. In the arts, the tendency has been to strip each art to its inessentials and to disclose the underlying basis of pure form. The purity of form he sought, it turns out, was more explicitly revealed in Viking Egeling's Diagonal Symphony, which, unlike Aiken's verse, has long held pride of place as an inaugural event in the development of an ultra-modern art form, abstract cinema. So you have to think of these two things as happening simultaneously. The pilgrimage of Festus, with its aspiration to recover this vanished world of fin de siècle, hankering after musical effects in literature, and Viking Egeling and Hans Richter producing these abstract cinematic things the same period of time, 1922, 1923, also inspired by the musical analogy to arrive at something that Egeling thought of as the ground base of nature. Diagonal Symphony and the rhythm studies of Hans Richter were animated extensions of the pictorial abstraction underway in painting. Kandinsky, Kupka, and Delaunay and others began venturing into abstraction around 1910, 1911, 1912, but already in 1906, Charles Caffin complained in the journal Camera Work that painting was cluttered with the obvious, and that in order to keep itself in living competition with the superior impressiveness of modern music, it must take on something of quality which is the essence of music, the abstract. To pass from absorption in the concrete to some companionship with the universal and the abstract, those are Caffin's words again, was, as Caffin supposed, the future of art. Before Marinetti proclaimed the hygienic services of futurism in 1909, there was a legacy of exhortations to the future. Most influential was Richard Wagner's manifesto, The Music of the Future, a title reprised by the dancer Isadora Duncan in her manifesto, The Dance of the Future. Friedrich Nietzsche's gesture of personal gratitude to Wagner was the birth of tragedy out of the spirit of music, and only a slight adjustment of his title gives us another working formula, the birth of abstraction out of the spirit of music. Nietzsche's book was published in 1872, and the very next year is the year in which Walter Pater famously observed that all the arts were aspiring to the condition of music. Nietzsche was alarmed by the adulation of Richard Wagner, although he was initially a devotee to such an extent that Wagner had to convince him not to resign his post as a professor of philology at the University of Basel in order to become a full-time Bayreuth groupie. But Nietzsche was alarmed by the adulation of Wagner, complaining that Wagner had become an oracle, a priest, indeed more than a priest, a kind of mouthpiece of the in itself of things, a telephone from the beyond. This is, by the way, one of the earliest references to a telephone that I've discovered a human being making just after telephones were invented. So Nietzsche was, you know, if he were living now, he would have made reference to a Twitter account, I suppose. It was Wagner's music, fittingly, that was chosen for transmission over telephone in 1891 at the Paris Electricity Exposition, where Thomas Edison's dynamo made its grand debut. The liberation of the song from the singer by technological means is no less momentous than the emancipation from text from Troubadour after Gutenberg. In 1900, the art journal Die Jugend published a sketch by Pauline Eigner of a performance of Wagner's Tristan und Isolde that you see in the bottom of the screen there, depicting numerous figures in a state of the most extreme self-absorption, overcome by music, quote, so internal, so organic, so visceral, that it seems like the reprise not so much of a musical motif as of an attack of neuralgia, unquote, in Proust's description of the Wagnerian malady. Their nearly cataleptic postures might be found in the waiting room of a maternity ward. In Eigner's rendering, Tristan and Isolde is a one-way ticket to the beyond for these astronauts of inwardness. victims of that ineffable yearning ascribed to music by E.T.A. Hoffmann early in the 19th century. A major re-estimation of music had been implicit in Hegel's notion of romantic art as the art that was no longer tied down to a mimetic contract, capable of producing its own object. The goal of the work was not to replicate a given scheme, but to constitute itself as a new component of reality. Music came to epitomize this obscure object of desire, especially when signifying a state of consciousness rather than a performance. Music served as incentive to achieve similar results in other art forms and in other media. In the process, it became the contagious ambassador of an aspirational touchstone, a way of envisioning a vita nuova in art, in which every sense petitioned another sense in reverential synesthetic courtship. So John Gould Fletcher and Conrad Aiken were belated idolaters at the shrine of music. During its rise to eminence in the last half of the 19th century, music had been diffused into an evocative intersensory musicality. So a deceptively simple question, to what sense is music addressed, would have prompted surprising responses in the twilight years of the 19th century. We now hear undeniable rays of light, Mallarmé attested. I mean that since Wagner appeared, this is Mallarmé, music and verse have combined to form poetry. And as you can see on the screen there, he said, our present task precisely, now that the great literary rhythms I spoke of are being broken up and scattered in a series of distinct and almost orchestral shiverings, is to find a way of transposing the symphony to the book. Richard Wagner, in the kind of attributions that Mallarmé makes, was not the Saxon composer, but code name for a decisive reckoning with artistic destiny as such in any medium. Maurice Denis, who's painting splotches of sunlight on the terrace you see in the upper right. Is it upper right? Yes. Maurice Denis compared the orange motif in a painting to the seduction of the violins in the Tannhäuser Overture by Wagner. The luminous palette of Denis' mentor, Paul Gauguin, mirrored his conviction that the function of color was to provoke musical sensations, to solicit the language of the listening eye. And the preface of my book, History of the Shiver, is titled The Language of the Listening Eye. The prospect that a musical sensation might be induced by a visual image reflected a widespread aspiration in which every art form was thought to petition the sensation specific to another art. Denis referred to a fellow painter with a stupefying neologism, polychrophilharmonique. It was a thoroughly reciprocal arrangement. Debussy was known as the whistler of music, and in his setting of Mallarmé's Prelude to the Afternoon of the Faun, transported the poet's atmospheric blur on stage, where Nijinsky brought the faun to life, photographed in situ by pictorialist photographers Baron Adolf de Meyer and Karl Struss, in a typically kind of blurred lens format in the picture on the right by Baron de Meyer. It was a milieu in which someone like the American composer Arthur Farwell could write tone pictures after pastels in prose in 1895 for piano. The full title given by Paul Signac to his 1890 portrait of anarchist editor and critic Félix Fénéon is characteristic, Opus 217, against the enamel of a background rhythmic with beats and angles, tones and tints. After James McNeill Whistler's first solo exhibition in London in 1874, in which all but one of the canvases bore musical titles, painters had started calling their efforts sonatas and fugues and symphonies, and the impenetrable, if infinitely suggestive verses of Mallarmé served notice that poetry had broken through some barricade beyond which words really could sparkle in the mind like visual music, leaving the dictionary behind. Composers gradually began to shed the security apparatus of tonal centers under the sway of Wagner. And I, in this book, use the term sublime impudence, a term borrowed from Friedrich Schlegel, the German romantic theorist. Erhabene Frechheit is the German. For this widespread initiative by artists to purify or transform their artistic means beyond recognition. This intersensory swoon augured an inaugural moment expressed in Jugendstil designer August Endel's conviction that we are not just at the beginning of a new period style, we're witnessing the onset of a completely new art. An art with forms that designate nothing and depict nothing, and recall nothing, but will be able to stir our souls so deeply, so powerfully, as before only music has been capable of doing with sounds. When Endel published this vision in the journal Dekorative Kunst in 1897, the urge to extend the principles of decor, that subordinate art, to the presumptively higher arts was in full swing, but this immodest tendency would end up knocking all aesthetic principles off their pedestals in years to come, much as Endel's ex-wife, Else von Freytag-Lornhoven, would unsettle and reanimate the burgeoning Dada enclave in New York during the First World War. I should explain that picture in the upper right is Endel's design for the Elvira photography studio in Munich. It no longer exists in that form. The Nazis effaced it as being somehow improper, architecturally speaking, in the late 1930s. The fabled Ahrensburg Salon, which you see down in the bottom there, in New York, accommodated Marcel Duchamp, Francis Picabia, all of these people that you see, depicted Man Ray, Nina Loy, William Carlos Williams, Wallace Stevens, and not depicted there, the French composer Edgar Varese, among others, in a milieu resonant with the fin de siècle salon of the old world and artistic cabarets like Chat Noir in Montmartre. At one of the so-called incoherent exhibitions sponsored by Chat Noir, Mona Lisa could be seen blowing smoke rings out of a pipe more than 30 years before Duchamp added the famous mustache and goatee. Another exhibition featured an all-black painting by Paul Biot, cheekily titled Negroes Fighting in a Cellar at Night, beating Kazimir Malevich to the punch, as it were, decades before his black square. At stake, though, is not who did what first, but what such quizzical escapades about say about the constraints and the opportunities of art. This was the perspective brought by the Swedish multi-talented individual August Strindberg in 1894 to the subject of the new arts, or the role of chance in artistic creation. Strindberg recalls a musician, and he's writing this 50 years before John Cage's treated piano, who amused himself by tuning his piano anyhow without rhyme or reason. He then played Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata from memory. It was an incredible delight, Strindberg writes, to hear the old piece so rejuvenated. Strindberg's affirmation of the role of chance in artistic creation led him to expose sensitized photographic plates outdoors overnight. In these celestigraphs, as he titled them, what we could see could be the heavens or just a patch of ground or mere photochemical stains, Rorschach blots of the cosmos, in other words. With such prospects and experiments underway, the fin de siècle turns out to be, or to have been, an inscrutable threshold, an obscure conduit through which art passed like contraband, and what entered on one side was unrecognizable when it emerged from the other. It was a rare moment when elders in every field, in every art, conceded the field to their juniors, not in defeat, but in rapt anticipation of what might ensue. A comparable imbalance attended the emergence of Arnold Schoenberg's pupils, Anton Webern and Alban Berg, whose public success coincided with his own. That uncanny transfiguration, or simultaneity of impact of different generations, is registered in the rapport between Ezra Pound and Butler Yeats, who you see depicted along with Richard Aldenton and R.S. Flint and several other people, with Wilfred Scawen Blunt in the center there, who was married to Rossetti's daughter. And the very famous canto from the Pisan cantos, with a refrain pulled down by vanity, actually begins with a kind of a sentimental reminiscence about this moment, this meeting, and all of these poets, multi-generations, from Romantic to Victorian to Edwardian Britain, were all gathered together for this photograph. This uncanny moment that I'm talking about is registered in the rapport between Pound and Yeats when the younger poet became the improbable tutor of an elder whose tutelage he had initially sought out. In 1934, Yeats struggled to account for the evolving hybridity of Pound's epic poem. Certain typical books, wrote Yeats, citing Pound's cantos, Joyce's Ulysses, and The Waves by Virginia Woolf, suggest a philosophy like that of the Sankara school of ancient India. Mental and physical objects alike, material, that is, all becoming materialized in the same way. A deluge of experience breaking over us and within us, melting limits whether of line or tint. Man, no hard, bright mirror dawdling by the dry sticks of a hedge, but a swimmer, or rather the waves themselves. A decade earlier, Yeats had written an autobiographical account of the 1890s under the revealing title, The Trembling of the Veil, which suggests something of the anticipatory mood, combining exaltation and dread that his century felt as the 20th century loomed up. The existential experience of this threshold prompted the amazed realization decades later by Wyndham Lewis, the English artist and writer, I was present, I dimly recognized the passage of an entire people out of one system and into another. Paul Klee, the artist, likewise marveled, what a weighty destiny to be the hinge between this side and the other side, the hinge at the border of yesterday and today. And this, in some sense, this entire book, History of the Shiver, is about that hinge and about the longevity of that experience. Because so much of what we associate with modernism centers around avant-garde gestures of repudiation. You know, the classic gesture being the futurist one. You know, down to the tango and Parsifal, and let's murder the moonlight and declarations like that. But really, for a lot of generations, it was very much one of not wanting to repudiate the past, but definitely not wanting to repeat it. And so the challenge was how to somehow manage to retain the immensity of the past and revigorate it by coming up with something completely new and different, and hence the longevity of Pound's 1934 book title, Make It New, which curiously, most people who cite that imagine that he said something like that much earlier in his career. I've not been able to find any evidence that Pound came up with this phrase before giving it the title of this book of essays in 1934. Art historian Dario Gamboni speaks of potential images, it's the title of the book it is, as a characteristic impetus behind modern art, but the notion can be extended to other arts, all of them thought of as converging on potential art. Maybe even striking out the term art altogether, so nothing but sheer potentiality remains. The Dadaist rage for cancellation qualifies as a big no, prefacing an uninhibited yes. But even the fastidious decor of the Vienna secession seems perched on the cusp of the new century as a supplication. The uncluttered spaces in Joseph Olbricht's secession building in Vienna emphasize the vacancy as much as the artwork on the walls, which are spaced out with a lot of distance between them. Generously spaced, the art seemed to suggest the distance that needed to be traversed as each art went in search of intelligible contact with another art, like intergalactic travelers in search of life forms on other planets. The secession rooms were inspired by the Wagnerian quest for a totalized solution with Gesamtkunstwerk, but where Wagner sought an encompassing absorption of all the other arts into the grand spectacle of the music drama, the Vienna secessionists, like modernists in general, aspired not to summon and gather, but rather to reconfigure any work of art as an index to other arts, road signs and way stations like the Prounds of Elwazitsky in Soviet Russia, or in the case of what I just put up on screen there, Hanover, Germany, many decades later. Such an itinerary led artists to approach extinction with exuberance. Theodor Wizeba, the Franco-Polish editor of the Revue Wagnerienne, sensed that already the hour is near when musical sounds won't be capable of producing emotions if they're heard directly. Therefore, there will have to be a new music, written, not played, suggesting emotions without the intermediary of an audible sound. What a spectacular proposition. Music that can't be heard. As if to provoke this detachment of word from action, a production of Henri de Regnier's play La Gardienne in 1894 involved actors in the pit reading out loud lines which were mimed by the actors on stage. A dissociative feedback loop actually performed live. The famous actress Eleonora Duse thought, to save the theater must be destroyed. It needed airing out because the drama dies of stalls and boxes and evening dress and people who come to digest their dinner. Edward Gordon Craig, proponent of the Übung Marionette, declared, I wish to remove the word with its dogma but to leave sound, or the voice beauty of the soul. I wish to remove the actor with his personality but to leave the chorus of masked figures. I wish to remove the pictorial scene but to leave in its place the architectonic scene. And Swiss reformer Adolf Appia supplied the architectonic scenario in which a flight of stairs could be sufficient prompt for any plot. And I put this earlier production image from the premiere of the Ring Cycle at Bayreuth in 1876 to see what Appia was attempting to overcome with his theatrical renovations. And now we get to the Belgian part. The minimal settings that Appia provided for Wagner's music dramas was more or less concurrent with the hushed interiors of Willem Hammershøi, Georges Le Bon, and Javier Mellerby. The Man Who Passes and Stairway, in these works, we catch fleeting glimpses of figures in passing or on the verge of being swallowed up in their surroundings. These paintings commonly appear in portfolios, visual portfolios of symbolism, that any symbolist tendency is concentrated here in the peculiar property of the glimpse, a tiny apparition adding enigma to an otherwise pedestrian setting. But a glimpse is enough. Mellerby first exhibited his domestic interiors under the collective title, The Life of Things. Then a few years later, under a slightly different title, Emotions of Art, the Soul of Things. And then on a third go-around, he added the phrase, a modern synthesis. As modern synthesis, his furtive interiors convened a tabula rasa befitting the looming new century. Even an outdoor scene, like Peter Severin Kreuer's beach at Skagen, could achieve the same effect with its vast expanse of sand punctuated by diminishing footsteps leading to a very tiny figure on the horizon. A corresponding instinct in symbolist painting is the eyes closed motif, very widely practiced at the time. Sight renouncing itself, like the vacant interior, was an emblem for drawing a blank. And the title of the chapter of the book on symbolism is called Drawing a Blank. But it also suggested cross-pollination among the arts. To see someone foregoing sight is to witness attention directed elsewhere or otherwise. So the viewer of such an image is asked, through an active sight, to consider another sense, or by means of one art, to loot the inner sanctum of another. In symbolist painting, one often senses a kind of thematic huddling, suggesting the predatory nature of certain subjects, as though the subject chose the artist and not the other way around. So these scenarios of silence and absence that I've just shown you seem on the verge of releasing some sound, like the skittering of rats or a sudden flutter of pigeons. The quivering moodiness yearns for wiping the slate clean. Certainly the steady buildup of specification and description in realism and naturalism, detail heaped upon detail, reached some threshold by the fin de siècle, after which the artistic instinct took cover, seeking shelter in any image that seemed to say, no more, enough. This, however, makes it sound like a gesture of repudiation, whereas in many cases it was simply a matter of trying to draw a breath, find a moment of repose, a blank page or canvas to start from scratch. The superficial, surface variety of symbolist art reflects a latent desperation, as if someone had broken into a Hollywood property shop and tried on all the wardrobe offerings, arranged the furniture and decor in several miscellaneous millennia in every possible combination, and generally run riot with the accessories in a long manic night before the sobering daybreak. When Kazimir Malevich exhibited his Black Square in 1915, it was accompanied by a pamphlet in which he declared, "I have transformed myself into zero of form, and I have fished myself out of the rubbishy sloth of academic art. I have destroyed the ring of the horizon, and out of the circle of objects, the horizon ring that has imprisoned the artist and the forms of nature. This accursed ring, by continually revealing novelty after novelty, leads the artist away from the aim of destruction." The material fragility of Black Square has led to a sort of auto-destruction, and that's why I put that more recent image there of the Black Square with all of its cracks very visible. And this embrace of destruction was a widely shared aspiration inherited from 19th century progenitors. Mallarmé declared, hence the title of my book, "Destruction Was My Beatrice." His poem, A Throw of the Dice and Coup de Dé, was the poetic equivalent of the Black Square, reducing and reconfiguring space in a kind of gestural heraldry. Mallarmé's blackout canvas is like a sustained blink, after which motion and image can emerge again into the light of day, as if, or into the light of that magic lantern of cinema. As if applying scissors to Malevich's template, Francis Bruguière, an American artist from San Francisco, composed his film Light Rhythms in 1930. Just out of curiosity, has anybody seen this film? Does anybody know this? I should have brought a clip. It's an interesting movie. You just see film stills of it from the upper left down to the 3 on the bottom there. By means of, and this is all the film is, by means of paper cutouts filmed with various sources of illumination, Light Rhythms simulates the illusion of movement in a kind of cinematic trompe-l'oeil. Architectural Review described it as a departure from previous film practice in that it receives its animation from the movement of light on static form and not from the movement of form in static light, which was in fact the prevailing cinematic operation of the day. Bruguière's concept bears an affinity to the futurist ballet by Giacomo Balla from 1917, in which Igor Stravinsky's music accompanies nothing more, and you see it on the bottom of the screen there, in which Stravinsky's music accompanies nothing more than colored lights from dozens of sources animating a papier-mâché decor. Bruguière's own aspiration was far from futurism, though, as is evident in his reference to the fourth dimension as the effect I have long wanted to give, the effect of movement in the eye of the beholder, though the object itself was absolutely stationary when photographed. So with these paper cutouts, he was somehow striving after the fourth dimension. And I don't want to linger on fourth dimensional theory here. I, unfortunately, to great personal discomfort, had to spend some time writing an entire chapter about fourth dimensional theory in this book. But I will suggest that the reason that speculations on the fourth dimension rippled through the arts communities at the turn of the century and at the end of the 19th century was part of that premonitory gust blown from melomania, or the idolatry of music, from the 19th century into the 20th. So I'll offer one account of an experience that some at the time might have ascribed to the fourth dimension, but but the vocabulary here is different and it has a specifically technological provocation. A reviewer, evoking the experience of seeing a film shot by a camera mounted on the front of a locomotive in 1897, wrote, "The way in which the unseen energy swallows up space and flings itself into the distance is as mysterious and impressive as an allegory." Now, I take the use of the term allegory in this passage as a way of referring to refer to the way a familiar world is kaleidoscopically reconfigured into ciphers and emblems of an experience intense and yet oddly remote. Early cinema induced a keen allegorical shiver with its remorseless ability to devour the world and regurgitate it as a lava of images, a lava flow of images. Cinema was the technological allegory of a golden land in which images could be harvested like exotic fruit. A motion picture, as it was called then, was still a picture, but soon the principle of movement began to saturate even the still image. After Kodak introduced the portable camera in 1888, the precipient prospect latent in the snapshot sanctioned the instantaneous testament of the moment. Modernism measured by the split second. Monet's Haystack series is haunted by the click of the shutter. Futurism splits the click. In 1919, Malevich indicated, "I wish to create the new signs of my inner movement, for the world is in me. The way of the world is in me." For him, this entailed a drastic renovation of his medium, painting. For others, a new medium could impose comparable expectations. Consider the career of Edward Steichen. In a self-portrait from 1929, on the right, Steichen squats in profile before a screen on which silhouetted shadows of equipment disclose the paraphernalia of a professional photography studio. It's a striking contrast to an early self-portrait published in Camera Work in 1903, in which Steichen posed with a large paintbrush and palette, the painterly apparatus accentuated by the conspicuous manipulation of the photographic print, because that is a photograph after all, but it's a classic of what is known as pictorialist photography, in which the use of dragging scratch marks through the emulsion, printing with gelatinous materials that can be smudged with the finger and all of that, applies a kind of workmanship to a medium that was regarded as simply mechanical and incapable of bearing the direct traces of an artistic temperament. This self-portrait is a classic example of the photographic school of pictorialism, and it served as a visual passport for the man who passed deftly between the antagonistic worlds at the time of photography and painting. That Steichen triumphantly depicts himself as a painter by means of a photograph is the point, and his soft focus, patently manipulated print is meant to validate photography as an art in its own right. His portrait of the artist as artist in the traditional sense was not just a pose. Steichen's attempt to make a name for himself as a painter persisted as late as 1923, when he destroyed most of his canvases. He then spurned pictorialism, a pernicious influence he called it, and went to work working for Condé Nast, becoming the highest paid photographer in the world. His sharp focus dynamically lit models, Hollywood stars, and luxury products, gracing the leading fashion magazines of the day. By the end of the First World War, a conceptual door slammed on the vast Nibelungen horde of Richard Wagner's century, and many of Steichen's generation were to experience, like a head wound, the sensation of a before and after. Steichen was the most frequently featured photographer during the run of Alfred Stieglitz's legendary journal, Camera Work, but its final two issues turned a corner, prompting, in tacit antithesis, Paul Strand. Late in his life, Strand said, and these are all photographs in the final two issues of Camera Work by Paul Strand, examples of what became known as straight photography. Late in his life, Strand said, "I don't have aesthetic objectives. I have aesthetic means at my disposal." This is one way of approaching the differential equation of modernism, I think, and everything that I've been talking about here has to do with this curious term, where the real difference, I think, between 20th century art and 19th century art is that in the 19th century, people consistently had aesthetic objectives. They imagined beforehand what they were going to do, planned it out, and then produced it. And in that sense, all of the arts in the 19th century were proto-cinematic, which is to say they were produced as if they were the result of a studio production in some way. Everything had to be in place so that the final product could be achieved. In the 20th century, the norm rather moved closer to having aesthetic means, which is to say having something, an apparatus like a camera, and just figuring out what the hell you could do with it. The Wasteland, the most influential poem of the 20th century, offers a case in point. The title announces a grand theme, the wasteland, after all. But Eliot's aesthetic means are tawdry, haphazard, heterogeneous. Despite its eminence, I find it curious that the Wasteland is almost never referred to as a masterpiece. It doesn't display the poise and dignity of canonical works from antiquity. The chopped up, ungainly, rhetorically oppressive culture mongering of the Wasteland was disconcerting, if not outright repulsive, to Eliot's contemporaries. And if we remain reluctant to call such a poem beautiful, it's only because Eliot and company succeeded in stigmatizing what they called the beauty disease, their way of disavowing Victorian verse decorum. Aesthetic means were suddenly revealed to be lacking in aesthetic objectives by works like The Wasteland. Versification on autopilot was apparent everywhere, from Victor Hugo to Algernon Swinburne. The Wasteland was, in the realm of aesthetics in which poetry carried a certain torch, a premonition of the uninhabitable Pruitt-Ego housing project in St. Louis, spectacularly demolished in 1971 and gracing the photographic pages of architectural histories written ever since. The opposing modernist prescriptions, all or nothing, were rendered very conveniently in the opening hypothesis of John Ashbery's 1972 book, 3 Poems, and you see the first page of it there on the screen. I thought that if I could put it all down, that would be one way. And next, the thought came to me that to leave all out would be another, truer way. The first option, packing everything in, can be seen in the grandiose plans of Russian composer Alexander Scriabin for a work he envisioned under the title Mysterium. It was to have taken place in India, in a temple built, like Wagner's Bayreuth, strictly for this performance, although performance may be too quaint a term for an event that was to last a week and not only transform humanity, but to abolish space and time. These were seriously Scriabin's aspirations. A pipe dream, you might say, but consider Steele Mackay's Spectatorium, built for the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, strictly for a single production called The Great Discovery to commemorate Columbus' voyage to the New World. A spectatorio, wrote Mackay, is a metaphysical musical poem illustrated by the most advanced and artistic realism. Antonin Dvorak was commissioned to compose music for the production, some of which he later used in his most famous work, the New World Symphony. The Spectatorium accommodated an audience of 10,000. Its stage space was 380 feet wide and 480 feet deep. This is larger than a football pitch. With some 6 miles of railroad track to facilitate stage changes in a time of 40 seconds. For Mackay, however, it was not about scale and grandiosity, but about the illusionistic effects his inventions could produce. He patented models for something called a nebulator that could create fog, clouds, and even produce rain, a colorator, and an illuminoscope, adapting Edison's new electrical lighting apparatus for the stage. Plus, he devised a scroll system to assist the audience in understanding what was happening, a kind of manual predecessor to LED libretto displays now used everywhere in opera houses. In addition, the stage doubled as a water tank, with devices capable of producing wind and waves with visible consequences for Columbus' fleet, the Pinto, the Maria, and I can't remember the name of all American school children of my generation had to learn the names of these boats, but that was more than 50 years ago, and so I forgot the name of one of them. with visible consequences for the fleet. And the fleet for this performance was reproduced at 75% of the original size. That's how big this was. Prior to any performances, however, the spectatorium was demolished by a cyclone, and before construction could resume, the nation itself was hit by a financial recession, bringing to a halt Mackay's exorbitant vision. Within 2 decades, however, enterprises like the Spectatorium would become commonplace, not quite as public spectacles, but on film sets, like the massive recreation of ancient Babylon for D.W. Griffith's Intolerance, with its legions of costume figures choreographed by the modern dance pioneers Ruth St. Denis and Ted Shawn. The historical spectacle was a surrogate model for the more pressing issue of the exorbitant expansion of modern urban environments, Babylon giving way to Manhattan. One day, early in 1920, Pete Mondrian was sitting at a sidewalk cafe in Paris, luxuriating in the sights and sounds of the buzzing thoroughfare, sketching an article on the grand boulevards, in which he came to regard the city street as what he called a thought concentrator. Everything on the boulevard moves, he wrote. To move equals to create and to annihilate. All of this motion that he perceived decomposed the static unities, leaving as a result something like a live-action model of collage. Quote, Negro head, widow's veil, Parisienne's shoes, soldier's legs, cartwheel, Parisienne's ankles, piece of pavement, part of a fat man, walking stick knob, piece of a newspaper, lamp post base, red feather, unquote. That's Mondrian. As these fragments swim into view, quote, they compose another reality that confounds our habitual conception of reality, Mondrian wrote, producing, however, not a chaotic throng, but what he perceived as a unity of broken images, automatically perceived. In some ways, is the perfect credo of modernism, a unity of broken images automatically perceived. The crucial term here is automatically, because Mondrian was recognizing something later theorized by Walter Benjamin, namely, that modern life resists quiet contemplation. It can only be grasped in a state of distraction, bit by bit. The particular carries me away, Mondrian wrote, adding, that is the boulevard. Mondrian is famous for his grid paintings in primary colors, but the grid emerged from a quiver as Mondrian condensed the flickering of leaves and the shimmering of the ocean into the structural bones culminating in Broadway Boogie Woogie in 1943. It's a fitting reminder that Mondrian was no penitent or recluse, but a man who chose the artistic path of reduction, leaving it all out, as Ashbery said, rather than expansion, like the Spectatorium. His euphoric celebration of the perpetual present in his article, The Grand Boulevards, captures much of the spirit of what Richard Huelsenbeck called the Big X. From the everyday events surrounding me, Huelsenbeck wrote, specifying the big city, the Dada circus, crashing steam whistles, house fronts, the smell of roast veal, he discovered an impulse which starts me toward direct action, becoming the Big X. The Big X was not so much an equation as a force field. Insofar it was felt to emanate from something obscurely called Dada, it could appeal to those in far-flung places like Zagreb, where Dragan Aleksic conflated two of the signal stimulants of his time in the title of his magazine, Dada Jazz. A naked man in the first year as a Dadaist, he wrote, relishing the Big X in a neologism, no end in sightedness. The sensation of massed proximity was an increasingly recognized condition of urban life by the early 20th century, thematized in its dystopic aspect by Georg Simmel's influential essay, The Metropolis and Mental Life. Country cousins may have felt dismayed, but artists flocked to the city to experience the perceptual revelation of overstimulation. Ezra Pound's descent into the Paris subway to extract the famous two lines in a station of the metro is one example. Russian filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein would have recognized Pound's poem as an instance of what he called vertical montage, compressing the horizontal and temporal elements of a sequence into a synesthetic intensity. Intensity as a portent of totality. Eisenstein's example is the city on Rainy Night, which he says looks like the visual equivalent of jazz. Its rain-slick streets and neon lights blended into a depthless pulsation in which near and far are obscured, and all objects are absorbed into a spectacle that nullifies all perceptions of real space. This sounds like an uncannily accurate premonition of post-war film noir. In fact, Eisenstein's reference is keyed to an article by René Guillet, in which the Frenchman advances the hypothesis that in jazz everything is brought into the foreground. Therefore, in jazz everything is masked. Instead of Renaissance depth perspective, we now have the intensification of proximity. Parallel lines do not converge on the horizon, but remain strictly parallel until we're tugged right into the object itself. And, quote, we pull the picture towards us, at us, into ourselves as co-participants, writes Eisenstein. Consequently, Eisenstein says, speaking of his own art of cinema, we are not afraid to use close-ups, as in film, to depict the human figure out of its natural proportions, as it appears to us when it is 50 centimeters away from our eyes. We are not afraid of a metaphor that leaps out of a poem, not afraid of the sound of a trombone bursting out of the orchestra in an aggressive lunge. This is among the more explicit modernist affirmations of an aesthetics of singularity, a singularity which is constantly and instantaneously reabsorbed into the mass in split seconds, like a jazz solo circa 1927. A trombone soaring out of the ensemble in Eisenstein's model is not an exception to the aggregate, but something more like the prow of a ship with the force of the whole vessel behind it. The enunciation of imminent mass, the foreground about to be filled to the brim. Co-participation is not a delicate invitation or even an urgent demand, but the gravitational condition of a state of affairs. This world of immediacies was perhaps the most compelling of modernist enticements. Eisenstein thought of it as a healthy and carnivorous synesthetic polyphony. A healthy and carnivorous synesthetic polyphony. As if you can imagine the prow of the ship opening its mouth and just, you know, engulfing the iceberg instead of being capsized by it. An early film theorist, Ricciotto Canudo, emphasized what he called the luminous entities of film as the medium's essence, even to the degree that he said light must not be enslaved to the representation of human figures. Instead, characters should appear solely as light humanized into dramatic figures. When Canudo's friend, Jean Epstein, realized that a close-up of a revolver is no longer a revolver, it is the revolver character, he was not just making a technical point, he was celebrating a technical device as a fetish. Under this animistic covenant, the hand is separated from the man, lives on its own, suffers and rejoices on its own, and the finger is separated from the hand. As Epstein imagines it, this prismatic subdivision filters down even to the writer's fingernail clutching the pen. This passage from Epstein dates from 1926, therefore anticipating, but perhaps inspiring, The Hand from Andalusian Dog by Buñuel and Salvador Dali in 1929, with its colony of ants swarming from the human palm and its subsequent amputation, after which the hand seems to crouch in the street like a crab, being poked and prodded by a circle of onlookers. Buñuel and Dali may have thought they were making a surrealist film. In fact, they were fulfilling the terms of a collective fantasy on which Epstein and other theorists had long been embarked. In 1921, Epstein maintained in terms that patently anticipate everything attempted by Andalusian Dog. There are no stories, there have never been stories, there are only situations without head or tail, without beginning, middle, or end, without a wrong or right side. They can be seen from every angle, right becomes left, unlimited by past or future, they're the present. I'm going to conclude with an image that you may not recognize as an image, so I will explain, and there is the image. The poet Nina Loy uses the expression an interrupted cinema of suggestions to evoke the way Gertrude Stein dotes upon generative and regenerative increments of language measured out, as it were, frame by frame. Comparing Stein's phrasal shifts with the fractional tones in primitive music, Loy imagined this was a literature reduced to a basic significance that could be conveyed to a man on Mars. It is the variety of her mental processes that gives such fresh significance to her words, as if she had got them out of bed early in the morning and washed them in the sun. In similar terms, William Carlos Williams welcomed Stein's determination to work, smashing every connotation that words have ever had in order to get them back clean. Maverick American poet Laura Riding resorted to an image of prelapsarian purity. None of the words Miss Stein uses have ever had any experience. They are no older than her use of them. Riding accordingly inferred that Stein uses language automatically to record pure ultimate obviousness. Pure ultimate obviousness. Loy and Riding discerned in Stein's work something so thoroughly packed into the surface that a new world was convened. Stein's work was not hermetically coded, nor did it mimic childish prattle, as many people presume. It simply unfurled word upon word as if each use were unique to its occasion, and its occasion was the present in a sense that had gone unsurmised. Stein's works, Stein's words, bear up under the combined pressure of past, present, and future all together, preserving that flicker of intersecting domains that leaves a reader with the oblique perception that something more is going on than meets the eye, even though what meets the eye can feel like more than enough. The emphasis on her words as newly washed, freshly pickled, or just born honors Stein, even as it evades the common sensation of being overwhelmed by them, confronted by words congealed into a wall. This unpunctuated passage from her 1928 book, Useful Knowledge, may be read as a shout-out to Molly Bloom. But the act of reading is confronted here by a vocabulary so minimal, yet so repetitious, as to present a physical challenge to the act of seeing. The wall of words remains a wall, or thanks to Mina Loy, the plastic static of the ultimate presence of an entity. The plastic static of the ultimate presence of an entity. It was the production of such unprecedented entities that made modernism the culmination of German Romantic theory, among other things, with the sublime impudence of its autotelic objects and the emergence of music as universal aesthetic benchmark. As the episodes I've recounted here suggest, the aspiration and the striving were never coherently mapped out or planned or strategized as such. Rather, they manifested themselves as an intake of breath, a gasp, a shiver, and a wall. Whether dead end or shelter remains to be determined. Thank you.